we're going to continue completing the sample of the DBQ worksheet. We have already constructed the thesis statement. Let's just review the question again. The prompt, hold on one second. The prompt asked to explain and assess, oh no, that's not our prompt. This prompt asked to explain and assess the varying underlying causes of the American Revolution and determine the single cause that most enticed the colonists to break away from Great Britain. Use the documents and your knowledge of the period 1754 to 1776 in constructing your response. And so we've already gone through what are the ways to organize the documents together after you've pieced them together in some kind of unifying theme. Then you put a label or a name to the relationship. And so we've already done that. We've organized the documents with the question in mind. And then we've answered the question in each category as far as what were the causes of the revolution. We found various different themes. Then we put those things together to craft the thesis statement. We also answered the second part of the thesis as to what was the single most important event. One thing that I want to point out here, notice how the thesis statement does not reference specific events. It doesn't reference specific people. Refrain from specificity in the thesis statement. It is not supposed to be narrow. It's supposed to be broad. It's supposed to in some way reference thematically whatever it is that you're analyzing of history. And so when you write the actual essay, then you go into the details and you reference specific events and people. We call that SFI. You generate specific factual information when you are providing support or defending your thesis. But when you're crafting the thesis, there is no need to reference specific events. And so the next part is you provide interpretive commentary. And so what that means is after you have crafted the thesis, you are pretty much going back and explaining how the document now supports your thesis or the primary claim that you're making. What in the document supports the thesis. And this has a lot of because. The word because oftentimes it is displayed in the interpretive commentary part. And so document A, because Great Britain increased taxes in America for military protection, this contributed to colonial discontent. And so here you notice using the word because, you're referencing something specific in the document, and then you're linking it to your primary argument in your thesis, which is there is colonial discontent. Document B, because the colonists had no representation in Parliament, this caused the colonists to critique the validity of their government. All of this is going to lead to the revolution, in which we've primarily analyzed, well, what are the causes of the revolution? So, document C, because of the Stamp because the Stamp Act collected taxes on most paper goods, this angered the colonists and later caused them to rebel. That is the central focus of the prompt. Why are they rebelling? What is going on? When you move on down to document D, and after you revisit it, after the colonists were able to repeal the contested Stamp Act, this helped them to build momentum for the rebellion. And so after they speak out against the Stamp Act, obviously the Stamp Act Congress, then it's going to further entice the rebellion. The next document, document E, jot down a short sentence about it, of why or how it supports the thesis. And so the attack in Boston vilified the British on account of propaganda illustrated by Paul Revere that circulated around the colonies. So the British are also going to be vilified. All of this supports the thesis of the various different causes of the revolution. Document F, that was about the Boston Tea Party. An example of interpretive commentary for it, the Boston Tea Party created a greater rift between Britain and the colonies since the colonists willingly destroyed British tea. So that's kind of exemplifying how these two are creating different political ideologies. They're starting to drift apart as far as their belief systems. Document G, the colonists believed that all men were naturally free, which later caused them to rebel since they felt as if their liberty was restricted under British rule. So in our thesis, we talked about the restriction of liberty, and so that document, we're just kind of elaborating a little bit on what were some of the concerns of the colonists. And then finally, the last document, document H, because the colonists longed to be free, they sought to alter the governing system instituted by Great Britain. So that can kind of be a rationale as to, okay, why was the Declaration of Independence written, and how does that support our thesis? And so the last part of the DBQ worksheet is just to generate outside information, SFI. And this supports the body of the essay when you are defending your claims. For the sake of the DBQ worksheet, it asks you to generate at least 5 pieces of SFI for each document. And some of the documents will share as a SFI. Like, it's okay if document A and document C have the same piece of SFI. But just when you're planning the thesis for the sake of the DBQ worksheet, when you're in the planning phase, then you want to generate as much SFI as you can. But when you write the actual essay, you only need 15 pieces for the entire essay. So here, I'm going to talk about mainly how to generate SFI using association chains. And so all of these pieces of SFI relate. When you go back to document A, reading through, knowing this is a document generated by the British government, and they're mostly talking about revenue and taxes. Well, the first thing that I thought about was George Grenville. He was the head of the Treasury while all of the taxes were being passed. And so after I thought of George Grenville, he's mostly authorizing increased taxation. Then I first asked myself, okay, well, why has increased taxation occurred? Why is there a need for increased military protection as referenced in the document? Then that brought me to, well, the French and Indian War. Well, that's one of the reasons that there are increased taxes, because the colonists needed additional protection against the French and their Indian allies. After that, I then established this document into a category, the category being just restrictions or governmental means of governmental laws, or even kind of like taxes. And so I next thought about the Navigation Acts of 1763, because that will be a government ordinance that will restrict the colonists. Though it wasn't any kind of tax, it was still means of authority. And various taxes fall into that same category. Duties and customs, they are things that are unavoidable. You have to pay them. And these are decisions made by the government. And so Sugar Act and Stamp Act, those are just some examples of taxes. Since it's referencing in the document revenue, well, what are some examples of those taxes that will later be levied in the colonies? The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, those are examples. And so just kind of go on and use that same association chain for each document. So document B, some examples of suggested pieces of SFI: no taxation without representation, James Otis, Sons of Liberty, Declaration of Independence, John Locke. All of those things in some way relate to the British colonies trying to assert their authority, and also justify why they should not have to follow British rule. And they're mostly going to cite because they have no taxation without representation. This next document of the Stamp Act posts, the first thing I originally first think of course, is the Stamp Act. That's going to be the law that authorizes the collection of taxes. It authorizes the need for the stamp. And then I just brainstorm other means of British legislation that angered the colonists or that in some way restricted their rights or their liberty. So Quartering Act is another example, Currency Act, Townshend Act, the Tea Act. All of these had a similar response by the colonists, which would be a response of rebellion or feelings that these were unauthorized or in some way unjustified. So for document D, a few pieces of SFI here. Um, After the colonists convened together at the Stamp Act Congress, um, I immediately thought about, okay, well, what other examples did they convene together in a political body? The Stamp Act Congress was a political meeting. Well, so was the First Continental Congress. So was the Second Continental Congress. These are all examples of collective organization that later brought me to, well, the Committees of Correspondence is an example of collectivism. So is the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. And so that's an example just of really how association chains work, how one term leads you to another that leads you to another, and you're always thinking of the theme in mind or trying to recode the term so that you can attach it to another term, make it similar to another term. And so here, document E, the rendition of the Boston Massacre. So I first wrote down the Boston Massacre. Later thought of Crispus Attucks. He was the first to die in the Boston Massacre. I tied Paul Revere to it. He was the author, the person who, for the most part, published the document. And then after the Boston Massacre, I just also kind of ran into a dead end after Paul Revere. So then I started to recode the Boston Massacre. Okay, what is the bigger picture here? What is this an example of? And it's an example of British conflict, British and colonial conflict, or in some way, it's an example of an event that inspires colonial protest. Well, so did the Boston Tea Party. So then I added the Boston Tea Party because it related to the theme of the Boston Massacre. And after Boston Tea Party, then I thought of Sons of Liberty, who were mostly involved in the Boston Tea Party. And so for these last few documents, other examples of SFI, Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, British East India Tea Company, Trade and Navigation Acts, and John Hancock, all of those things relate to the document F. That's mostly, let's scroll down here. Document F that references the Boston Tea Party. And so Sons of Liberty, they were mostly involved. Samuel Adams was kind of like the leader of the Boston Tea Party. This is the company that they were protesting at the Boston Tea Party, the monopoly that the British East India Company had on the tea trade. What are other means of restrictive actions that impacted the tea trade? Well, the Trade and Navigation Acts, that related. And John Hancock, he automatically came into my head after I thought about a person being restricted by trade because he was a big time smuggler in the colonies. And then here, document G, from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. When I think of Virginia, I first think of Thomas Jefferson. He played a critical role in influencing politics, not only in Virginia, but also the whole nation. So when I first thought of Thomas Jefferson, I then thought of the Declaration of Independence, which made me then think of the American Revolution, which made me then think of a new Constitution and the first president, George Washington. Document H, the excerpt of the Declaration of Independence. I first thought of John Locke. He inspired Thomas Jefferson, and a lot of his ideas are kind of reworded in the Declaration of Independence. After I thought of John Locke, I then thought of Common Sense. That's his revolutionary pamphlet. It propels the American Revolution. After the Americans become their own government, they're going to have to create their own constitution. So the Articles of Confederation was just a similar legislative document. And so it won't have the same intended purpose as the Declaration of Independence, but it is a legislative document that affirms and declares things for the nation. And then the United States of America will just be the name of the new nation. So that's pretty much it. That's how you complete a sample DBQ worksheet for prompt B.